Hi everybody, welcome. As Mary said, my name is Eoghan Dalton. I'm a sculpture conservator. So I have a business conserving and restoring sculpture all over Ireland. I've been doing that for nearly 20 years, getting on for 20 years. It's very, very varied, the work that I do. Any kind of sculpture I'll take on. So just to give you a few examples of the sort of thing I might get up to. In Cork City, I did the Father Matthew statue there in Patrick Street, and I did the Berwick Fountain on Grand Parade, quite close to this area. A few years ago, I restored a high cross, a 30-foot high cross in limestone at the top of a big hill overlooking at the sea in a place called Rosscarbery, which I'm sure those of you who are from this area and live in this area will be familiar with. It's in a place called Castle Freak, which I always greatly enjoyed that name. And so that particular job was quite extreme, at quite an extreme end in terms of what I do. There was no vehicular access to the site, so I had to drive to a car park and then carry any tools and materials up a very steep hill in a wheelbarrow up to this 30-foot high limestone cross at the top of this hill. You could be down in the car park, and it was a nice balmy, spring morning, spring day, and by the time you got to the top of the hill, it felt like it was blowing a gale always whenever I was up there. So I remember on several occasions trying to work and nearly being blown off the scaffolding at the top of this 30-foot height and thinking, this is crazy, what am I doing? How did I get myself into situations like this? But it goes from that type of a job where you're working on a large outdoor monument down to, for example, more recently, I was in the Crawford Gallery there this summer, where I was removing the fig leaves from some of the sculptures by Antonio Canova. Well, that's slightly incorrect. The sculptures weren't by Antonio Canova, they were by Greco-Roman sculptors, and they were unearthed in the region of Rome during the Renaissance and that kind of time, and they're in the originals are in the Vatican Museum now. And as a result of a long, very interesting story, which I don't have time to go into now, Antonio Canova, who was the most preeminent sculptor of the neoclassical period, that is late 17th, late 18th, early 19th century, was commissioned by the Pope of the time to make casts of these sculptures in plaster, which were sent to Cork, and during the course of a previous period of restoration works to those plaster casts in the Crawford Gallery, I realised that the fig leaves that they had were probably not original. So this summer I went back to take them off, and that got a huge amount of publicity, and there was a film crew came over from the BBC in the UK to film what I was doing and all that. So that was kind of fun, really, and I got plenty of smart comments from Cork people about the work that I was doing on that occasion, along the lines of delicate work, that and that kind of thing. But I suppose, so that's a kind of a general outline of what I do. I trained in Italy, so I spent 7 years living in a place called Carrara in Italy, which is famous for its white marble. And in fact, the mountains all around Carrara are dotted with marble quarries There's 250 of them altogether in the surrounding region, and the quarries, the marble has been quarried in that region since the time of the Romans, and famous sculptors throughout the ages, such as Michelangelo and Bernini and Canova as well, all got their marble from the Carrara area. So it's got a huge, or a very long association with sculpture, going way back. And I spent 7 years there learning to carve stone and marble sculpture, but also I learned conservation and restoration of sculpture there. The most important thing I'd really like to say is that over the course of the nearly 2 decades that I've been doing this, I would say that the vast bulk of the work that I have to do is trying to undo things that people have done in the past to restore or conserve a monument or a sculpture. So people do things that they think, oh sure, this, we'll slap a coat of this on, or we'll chisel that off and put a lump of cement on there and it'll be grand, or whatever else. They do things thinking they're going to improve the situation, but it actually makes the situation worse. And as I say, the vast bulk of the work that I'm asked to do is in effect remedying actions that have been taken in the name of conservation and restoration in the past. So following on from that, I think the most important thing to say is, if you're considering working on doing anything to historic monuments, think about what you're doing and then think again, and unless you're absolutely certain that it's necessary, don't do it. That'd be the first and most important thing that I'd like to say. Towards the end, I'll say something very quickly about reversibility, which is an important core principle of what I do. And what that means is that whenever you're carrying out whatever you're doing to a historic monument or work of art, where possible, you should always try to keep the actions that you take to limit them to reversible actions. So if you have a choice between something that you're going to be able to do, and if somebody in 30 years or 50 years decides that was the wrong thing or a mistake, they can undo that without difficulty, then that action should be taken rather than the one where you can't go back. So I'm going to talk about another monument that I worked on several years ago in Cork's Grand Parade, which is the National Monument. The National Monument they decided to build this monument in 1898 because they wanted to commemorate the centenary of the 1798 rebellion, but it took time for them to raise the funds to build it. So the money was raised through public subscription, and I suppose various nationalist organisations went around trying to get the money together. And I think the corporation, Cork Corporation, also contributed. But it took time for them to raise the funds to build it, and it wasn't until 1906 that it was actually completed. And it was built from 3 materials. So most of it is in Cork limestone, which is a wonderful material. It's a beautiful, attractive material. It's a very pale, light blue in colour, in contrast to the more common around Ireland Kilkenny marble, which is much darker and has much more evident fossils through it. Most of it varies a fair bit, but Cork limestone is, I think it's a lovely material. When I was working on the monument, I met a few monumental masons who told me that they explained to me that Cork limestone never came from one source. There were lots of little quarries all around the place. And the material that came out of each one was always slightly different. There was variation between, there's a bit of variation between different types of Cork limestone, and even within the same quarry there could be significant degrees of variation between different beds of stone. So I was asked by Cork City Council to survey the monument in 2012, and I went along and I had a look, and there were several issues that I found with it that I recommended be remedied, and they asked me would I do the work, and I said I would, so I ended up doing the work as well. Now what they were, I suppose I'll take you through the restoration project as I carried it out. Sorry, just before I continue with that, I was talking about Cork limestone, and there were two other materials used in the monuments. They were Connemara marble and Middleton red marble. And it was only during the course of working on the monument over several months that it occurred to me that there was probably no coincidence at all in the fact that they're all Irish materials. So there was no Carrara marble or Portland limestone from England or anything else from it. I would say that there was a conscious decision made to use only, in inverted commas, native Irish materials in building the monument. As I said, the monument was to commemorate the centenary of the 1798 rebellion, but it also records the two other rebellions, the 1803 rebellion of Robert Emmet, and, well, it wasn't really a rebellion, I suppose, but kind of fizzled out a bit from what I know of it. And then there was a Fenian rising in 1867 as well. So the monument, the 1916 obviously hadn't happened by that stage by the time this was going up. So the monument records those three events and the participants in those three rebellions. So on each side of the monument, there's four sides obviously, and each one has two panels inset into kind of neo-Gothic style kind of blind alcoves, and in each panel there's an inscription with quite a lot of names of people who participated in the various rebellions and risings. And then there are more inscriptions outside of those panels, and those are an important feature in the monument, which I'll talk about after, because they required a lot of work too. But the three Irish materials kind of fitted into that ethos of kind of nationalism that gave rise to the construction of the monument in the first place. So there were several things wrong with the monument. It was heavily soiled. It's in a very central location where there's a lot of traffic, not just cars and trucks and all the rest, but also people walking around it, and you get people throwing cans of stuff over the railings and bags of chips and all sorts of things, which, you know, bring a certain level of degradation of the stonework, and can leave unsightly staining. And then there was quite a high level of biological growth all over the monument as well. So you're talking about lichens, mosses, algae, and even vascular plants. So when I say vascular plants, I mean higher level plants, flowering plants, even little trees and so on, growing out of the joints between the stonework. So and further to all that, the monument had been pointed in cement mortar, which is a big problem. Originally, monuments like this would have been constructed using lime mortars, which are far better for stone, for a whole variety of reasons, which I'll explain in a moment. Over time, the original mortar would have weathered out of the joints at the face of the monument, and somebody made the decision, as is so common in these cases, to repoint those joints with a cement mortar. Cement has only been around for, well, it's only been really used in Ireland since the end of the 19th century, but I don't think it really came into common use in Ireland until quite considerably later. You know, maybe a half a century later, it starts to get really common in Ireland. So I'm guessing that pointing happened sometime after that. The issues with cement in historic monuments, there are several, and they're mostly quite serious ones. So one of the most important things when you're working with historic monuments is not to use Portland cement. It's just one of the rules. You never use what's called OPC, ordinary Portland cement. You just do not use it in when you're working on historic monuments. It's bad news. The reasons why are, first off, cement is produced using a range of modern chemicals which over time leach out onto the stone and can damage the stonework. But that's probably the most minor of the reasons why you shouldn't use cement. The purpose of a mortar joint between stone is not to stick the stones together, contrary to what you might think if you were building a stone of bricks or blocks. If you were building a wall of bricks or blocks now, where modern cement kind of has that function of to nearly glue the building components together. In historic monuments, that wasn't its purpose. It was to act as a cushion between the different building elements. So what it would do, it would provide some elasticity in the monument. So if there was any movement of the monument with settling, or when there'd be storms or whatever, high winds, the monument would be free to move a little bit without cracking. Cement doesn't allow that. Cement is extremely hard, extremely high compressive strength, and it doesn't allow that movement, which can cause massive problems to a monument. The other factor is that cement is almost impermeable, so it can be impermeable. So if you have water ingressing into the monument from above in times of high rainfall, which we get plenty of in Ireland, you can actually just about make out a small tree growing out of a joint here. But when you have high rainfall and you have water ingressing into the monument and soaking down through it, which is inevitably going to happen, you're never going to be able to keep all of that water out. And cement, because of its rigidity, tends to crack rather than kind of staying with the surrounding blocks. You get these cracks and the water seeps in there, and when it gets down, oftentimes it has difficulty getting out, and sometimes maybe it does get out where there's a break in the cement, where the cement mortar has failed or there's cracking, and it comes out all in that one point, creating staining with algae stains, or maybe salts from the inside and the interior of the monument coming out onto the surface of the stone, and creating disfiguring results, making it look wrong. So for a whole number of reasons, Portland cement is just a bad idea. So the first thing I had to do was to rake all that out of the joints, starting from the top and working my way down, and that was a big job. The monument is built with what's called ashlar, which is a type of construction technique. Earlier you would have been seeing Eamon explaining his work to the return of a medieval church, which was built in a very different way. That's built with random rubble stone. So those were natural stones that were taken from fields. As with agriculture, if you were ploughing a field, stones would come to the surface, and a lot of the stones would be on the surface anyway, even without ploughing. And they were taken to one side and used to build buildings, and each one is different, and they're all sorts of odd shapes. And when you build in that way, you need a very thick bed of lime mortar, somewhere between maybe 3/4 or even an inch thick. And the reason why it has to be thick like that is to kind of accommodate all the irregularities that are there in these stones, which are all sorts of irregular shapes. With ashlar, it's very different. Each block is carved very precisely into a rectangle or whatever other shape is required for the position it's going to be used in, and the joints are very, very thin. So the joints are generally, in ashlar, they're only about 3 mil, which equates to about an eighth of an inch or so. So only about that thick, and sometimes half that or less. So raking the cement out of joints that thin is difficult, because you haven't got much room to work with your chisel. So I was using a very thin, fine letter carving chisel and a small letter carving hammer as well. And I worked my way through the whole monument, raked out all of the cement mortar. The next thing to be done was to treat the whole monument with a biocide. Biocide is a chemical which you apply, which sits on the stone and kills all organic growth. So it'll kill the algae, the lichens, the mosses, and so on. The higher order plants, the trees and the flowering plants and so on, they have to be pulled out and all of the roots extracted, and the area sprayed with biocide as well, deep into the joints, to stop them from regrowing. Biocide has to be applied when you know that there's not going to be any rain for at least 3 hours to come, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First off, it won't work. If it gets washed off by the rain, it won't work, it'll be ineffective. But the other thing is that it's obviously biocide, it's a toxic chemical for living organisms, and if it gets into water courses in particular, it's extremely damaging. It'll kill everything in streams or rivers or anything like that. So you have to be very careful of how you use it. And what I would generally say in a situation like this is that it's really, products like that should really only be used under specialist supervision. So I wouldn't be recommending that you go out and buy biocide and put it on monuments, because it can it can damage the local environment. It can be very damaging. But the biocide, I would generally leave it for maybe at least several days anyway, 3 days minimum, and the more the better, because what it does is it kills all the growth on the surface of the stone, making the stone then afterwards easier to clean. And the way I cleaned this monument, the way I had it cleaned, was I used a micro-abrasive system. So to somebody who didn't know better, it kind of looks like sandblasting, but it's completely different. It uses a vortex action. The medium comes out in a vortex action, which means that a much lower pressure is required for cleaning. And the medium is composed of millions of tiny little glass spheres which explode on impact with the stone, so there's no force exerted on the stone, and with the very low pressure, this system is able to take off any soiling, any dirt, the remains, the residues of the dead algae and lichens and so on, without affecting the stone underneath in any way. And Cork City Council were a bit dubious about me using this system. So the guy, I had a colleague who was going to be using the system, a guy called Brendan Waters, who's based up in County Meath. He came down and he did a demonstration for Cork City Council where he got a Coke can, and he used his Rotec micro-abrasive system on the Coke can, and what it did was it took off the paint, but it didn't touch in any way the aluminium underneath. And aluminium is a very soft metal. It's much softer than limestone. So it just showed how very gentle a cleaning technique that it is, and Cork City Council, the people in there were happy with that, and they let us proceed. So Brendan went ahead and cleaned the monument from top to bottom using his system then, at which point I had to then replace the cement mortar with lime mortar, and I used a natural hydraulic lime which comes pre-mixed. So you've got the lime mixed in with the sand, very consistently mixed, ready to go. All you have to do is add water. I used that in a 3.5 strength. So it comes in different strengths. There's the regular ones are NHL 2, NHL 3.5, and NHL 5. NHL 3.5 is the most commonly used one, and it's the one I've used for most works that I've done. I used the NHL 5 for another monument nearby to here, which is the Berwick Fountain, just further up Grand Parade, where Oliver Plunkett Street meets Grand Parade. There's a fountain there dating to the 1860s. And the reason why I used NHL 5 in that instance was that I decided, together with the people I was dealing with in Cork City Council, that was required due to the constant presence of moving water, and also the high level of interaction that happens every day between the public and that fountain, because there's a kind of a low parapet that keeps in the first basin, if you like, of water, or the lower basin. The fountain is designed in such a way that you have there's a fountain at the top which the water comes out of. It flows into a small bowl and then flows out of that down, cascades down into a lower bowl, and from that down into the final one, which is at ground level. And the lowest one is composed of large blocks of Cork limestone, that come up to just about this height, which is perfect for people to sit on. So there's always people, especially teenagers, but people in general sitting on it. And that level of abrasion and interaction in a general sense together with the water dictated the use of a NHL 5 rather than 3.5. But in this case, with the National Monument, a 3.5 pre-mixed mortar I used. So I put it into the joints, ensuring that the mortar penetrated as far into the joints as possible. So it's important that you don't just butter it into the face of the joint. It has to penetrate right to the back of the void to wherever you're coming into contact with the original lime mortar that was used to build the monument. So that all worked out very well. When after pointing the joints, I'd sponge them back to get a nice, neat kind of neat-looking joint. Now, the other major issue with the National Monument I already touched on, which is regards the inscriptions at the base of the monument. So I'll just run through a few photographs now. This is the monument after cleaning and repointing and all the rest of it. So that gives you an idea of the kind of facelift that was achieved, and the feedback was very good. People were generally very happy with the results, especially Cork people who've had the monument in their midst all their lives. It's a funny monument in some ways. It's very important. It holds an important place in Cork people's kind of subconscious, in terms of it's a real landmark, not just a physical one, but also a kind of like a psychological and a cultural one. But at the same time, you know, I think it's one of those situations where it's been there for so long that people oftentimes hardly even noticed it until I came along and started restoring it, and then they were you know, very interested in it and were engaging with me about it on a constant basis. So I think we skipped one there. Oh no, that's, yeah, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So there are 5 statues with together as part of the monument. This is Mother Eoghan, who's right in the middle. She's under this. She's covered by the monument above, and then there's another one on each of the 4 corners, each of whom is an important figure in the movement for nationhood. So Wolfe Tone, Thomas Davis, and a couple of other people. Mother Eoghan is larger than life size. The other figures are smaller than life size, and she was in fairly good condition, but she had some build-up of what's called black crust, which is really just the easiest way to understand what black crust is. It's a bit like if you have iron which rusts and corrodes in the rain, in the wet. Black crust is the result of pollutants in the form of acids that are carried in condensed water that condenses on the stonework when it's cold. And it alters the surface of the stone from calcium carbonate, which is what limestone is, into calcium sulfate, otherwise known as gypsum. So that was all cleaned away by the Rotec microabrasive system. So there she is after works. Now you can also see the difference in the dark cement joints have turned to very pale lime joints, and there are the Connemara and the Cork red marbles as well, in the form of small columns, just maybe 4 or 5 inches in diameter on each side of the monument. They had weathered much worse than the Cork limestone. A lot of those, particularly the Connemara marble, were in a very fractured and damaged state just from being out in the weather. Marbles often, because they're chosen as decorative materials, because they've got all sorts of very attractive veining and so on through them, different colour variations, and that makes them nice to look at. But it also, those different materials within the marbles are going to create tensions and weaknesses within the material, making it more likely to degrade faster than the likes of Cork limestone, which is a more homogeneous material. So a lot of those had to be repaired with stainless steel joints in between and so on. There's Wolfe Tone. Before cleaning, he's got a very heavy level of lichen growth on his chest and shoulders. There's also algae growing all around his head, and his left arm here has black crust in several areas, as well as a mixture of algae and mosses and so forth. Now, after cleaning, here they are. It's not quite the same angle, but it does bring me to what I want to talk about at this point, which is these panels, because this is another, I suppose, the two biggest ways in which the monument had been damaged by past interventions was the cement pointing, but also the manner in which the paintwork in the inscriptions had been renewed. So I'm going to talk about the inscriptions for a moment, but everything I'm going to say about that is applicable to any hand-cut inscriptions, including grave stones and tombstones and any kind of grave markers where there's hand-cut lettering. It's all, everything I'm saying applies equally to those things too, and all the other many circumstances in which you get hand-cut lettering. So the first thing I'll say about hand-cut lettering is until about the 50s or the 60s, pretty much all lettering in stone was done by hand, and it was an extremely skilled art. It was something that was generally done, certainly in Italy, where I learned to carve letters in stone myself, along with sculpture and so on. There, it was a craft in its own right. It was separate to carving sculpture. It was something completely independent. There was a word for the guys who did it. They were called parolai, which comes from parola. Parola is word in Italian, so parolai were the guys who basically did the words. And they were an extremely respected artisan group in their own right. In the 50s and 60s, well, more the 60s and thereafter, other mechanical industrial methods started to be used, and there was the reason for that was that it was much cheaper. Carving an inscription by hand is very, very slow and time consuming, and the person who does the work has to be highly skilled. So to be able to get rid of all that and instead use a machine, there were obvious attractions for that. I suppose on certain levels as well, people were making the argument that, well, if something is machine cut, everything is going to be absolutely uniform, identical, no variations. And so for a variety of reasons, letter carving as an art died away from the 60s, 70s on, and there's very few people still are able to do it. And it's a great pity, because machine cut lettering, there are several ways of doing it. Generally, it's either cut with it's either milled out by a kind of a revolving machine tool, and sometimes it's also sandblasted into the stone. But whichever method is used, it leaves a very different result. If you examine the two closely together, hand cut lettering has a real life to it. It's got a real personality. It's every single letter is never the same as others. So all of the S's are slightly different to each other. All of the E's, all the F's, all the rest of it. And it's every individual carver has his own slightly distinct style and maybe peculiarities. Every age, every period of time had its preferred calligraphic style that tend to come into fashion for a while and then go out. So you can generally age a tombstone straight away without looking at the date, just by the type of calligraphy that was used to carve the lettering. And there's so much artistry in a hand carved inscription that you don't get in a machine cut inscription. It's dead by comparison. And purely on the level of the amount of time and skill that went into hand cutting an inscription, there's enormous respect due to that, even never minding for a second the fact that it's a historic monument and it's been there for a considerable time, and that's another element to why it needs to be preserved. But unfortunately, and this is something I see all over the country wherever I go, this is one of the inscriptions on the monument, and it's barely legible. And there's two reasons why it's barely legible. You can't make anything out there. This just to give you an idea, this is what it would have, roughly what it would have been like originally when it was first carved. So that's the inscription after restoration. So I'll just talk for a second about why it was in this state. Over time, so the letters are painted to make them stand out more. The paint is put into the margins of the letter. Over time, that paint weathers out, so with the rain and the frosts and all the rest of it, the paint starts to flake and crack and peel away from the substrate behind. After a while it starts to look patchy, maybe after 10, 15, 20 years, and somebody starts saying something needs to be done with that monument, and the letters need to be repainted. And again, this all applies absolutely to any kind of grave markers as well, and any other hand-cut inscriptions. So at that point there are two methods that are used to renew the paint in an inscription. One of which is really fast, gives fantastic results because it's very fast, it's very cheap, and it looks amazing, but it's hugely damaging to the monument. But it's the one, because it's cheap and fast and gives superficially amazing results, it's the one that's invariably used, and it's an absolute disaster, because what it is, it's somebody comes along with a paintbrush and a pot of paint, and they go over everywhere where there's lettering, and some of the paint goes into the letters, but most of it goes over the surface, the kind of the flat surface of the inscription, and they leave that then for a day or two so that the paint will set, and then they come back with an angle grinder and they go over the surface, abrading away all of the paint, but also a layer of stone underneath. And as I say, it looks fantastic because it brings up a fresh layer of stone. Everything looks brand new. It's really quick. It takes off all the paint except the paint that's in the letters. Everything looks really bright and fresh, and it only took several hours, so everybody's delighted. But bearing in mind that an inscription, the paint in an inscription will need to be renewed every 15 years or so, you know, over half a century, that inscription is going to get hit 3 times, and each time you're losing a couple of millimeters of stone. So over the course of several renovations like that, you start to actually lose the letters. They start to disappear. Initially, the more finely cut the parts of the letter which are less deeply incised, they'll begin to disappear. The serifs and maybe the cross in a capital A, whereas the two kind of the two diagonal uprights will be still intact, but the piece going across will disappear, and then the serifs at the bottom of the capital A, those kind of nice ornate pieces that go like that, they'll vanish. And then after another couple of times, even the whole A will start to, you'll only be able to make out the faint outlines of the two diagonal pieces until the complete letter starts to disappear. So, you know, that's something which, if I can just get across 2 points here today, I'll be happy, which are, please never ever use Portland cement on anything historic, and never ever use power tools, especially not angle grinders, in this manner here to renew lettering in cut stone. The proper way to do that is to take a fine brush and to painstakingly go over the whole inscription letter by letter, keeping your paint within the margins of the letter. So it's very tedious, time consuming. People don't like doing it. I had to do the entire monument myself, which took a couple of months, so I can well understand why people don't like doing it. But the alternative is to damage something which is hugely valuable. And in this case, with the National Monument, the inscriptions are really important because they're the primary aspect of the monument that people tend to engage with. When I was working away there, the number of people who came up to me and told me that such and such a name was their great-great-grandfather or their wife's great-uncle or whatever else. People have a real sense of ownership of the monument and engagement with the monument through those names of the participants in the various risings and so on. So hugely important. So the only... Sorry? Did you carve any of them out? Getting to that. So the only way to fix this, and as I say, you know, they were so badly gone, a lot of them were so badly gone that there was actually, when you got close to it, you could see there was like a kind of a depression across the face of the stonework that went right in from the repeated grindings with an angle grinder. So the only way of fixing that was to recarve a lot of the letters. Now I couldn't do everything myself, so I got a friend and a colleague who does a lot of letter carving. I can carve letters, but I'd be slower than him. He came along, a guy called Matthew Thompson, whose father, Ken, is probably the best known sculptor in stone in Ireland now. And Matthew is well on the way to kind of getting there himself. So Matthew came along and spent weeks recarving the lettering where it was really badly abraded away by angle grinders. Here's an inscription in Irish, and again, it's maybe not quite as bad as the previous one, but still, you know, very difficult to make out. And that's partly because the letters have been lost themselves. It's also because of the paint being missing from a lot of the letters as well. So, and here's again is the contrast between before, excuse me, and afterwards, when Matthew had recut the letters and I had repainted the inscription using the proper conservation method. So there's the difference there. And you can also see as well the difference in the pale lime mortar joints. There's a big difference between the very dark cement. And also you can see the way the stone came up with its very attractive natural colouring became apparent after cleaning. And so here's a shot of Matthew recarving one of the inscriptions that's outside the any of the panels. So you can see he's using a letter carving chisel and hammer, something very similar to what I used when I was raking out the joints of the monument. And it's a slow process. What Matthew's doing there, recarving letters that are already there, is faster than carving the letters in the first place. I'd say Matthew, if he was carving letters from scratch, he'd probably do about maybe 4 or 5 in an hour. I'd be much slower. I'd maybe do 2, depending on the size of the letters, maybe even 1, only 1 if they're big. In this case, it's a bit faster because the letters are already there. You don't have to mark out. You don't have to. You're just deepening what's already there. But even so, it was slow work, and it took Matthew several weeks of chipping away. And then I came along afterwards. Now this is a different inscription. I didn't have one of me on the National Monument, but this is another monument that I restored up in County Monaghan. On the Dartry estate, and again I had to go over it with a fine brush, and just keep the paint within the margins of the letters, and it's very, very slow. It takes a long time, but there's no alternative to doing it that way if you want to keep the monument intact. So I think that's kind of it. How am I doing for time?
Okay, just one, yeah, perfect.
Go through these.
4 minutes. Yeah,
okay. So a few general do's and don'ts that I've already talked about. The first 2 are the 2 big ones that I really want to get across more than anything else, which is always use lime-based mortars rather than cement. Never use that technique for renewing paintwork, which is to flood the letters with paint and go over it and to grind off the surface of the stone afterwards. That's to be avoided at all costs. Always carry out proper tests in an unseen area before applying treatments such as biocide, etc. I would go further than that. I would say it's probably better to only use chemicals on stonework of any sort, any kind of cleaning products, anything like that, with specialist supervision, because you can really damage stone if you use the wrong one or in the wrong way, in the wrong application. So reversibility is something I've already talked about. Consider whether, if you have a choice between doing something that can be removed at a later time, because fashions change, you know, what people think now is a proper approach may be considered not the right approach in 50 or 60 years, or a material that we think is fine now, it may be discovered that it's damaging or problematic in some way. So if you can do something that's reversible, then that's always better than an approach from which there's no going back. Documentation, document everything you do. A lot of the time I'm asked to go and have a look at a sculpture or a monument or something, and I can see that loads of people have worked on it down through the years. They've slapped on coats of this or that, they've added on lumps of this or that, they've taken off bits, they've stuck bits on, and I haven't got a clue. I have to try and piece together what has happened detective style, because there's never, almost invariably, there's no record of what was carried out in the past, and that is an issue. So any of my work, I'm always asked to provide some written documentation as well as photographs that can be filed away in the relevant place for that particular work. Then obviously safety is a really important one when you're doing any of these kind of works. So you have to be mindful of the safety of yourselves, of those around you, and also of the monument itself. So, you know, just take care and be thinking about what you're doing at all times, rather than just kind of going through it without thinking it through. I think that's about it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.